The morning of 6th of June 1944 broke grey and cold over the Normandy coast. Thousands of Allied soldiers, drenched and seasick from the Channel crossing, prepared to storm Hitler's Atlantic Wall. But beneath the sand and shingle of those French beaches lay something far more insidious than concrete bunkers or machine gun nests. Millions of buried mines, each one capable of tearing a man apart or turning a tank into a blazing coffin. Within the first hours of Operation Overlord, American forces landing at Omaha Beach discovered just how devastating these hidden killers could be. Entire platoons vanished in eruptions of sand and steel. Engineers crawling forward with bayonets and prodding sticks were cut down by German riflemen before they could clear even a meter of ground. The casualty figures mounting by the minute told a grim story that would haunt Allied commanders for months to come. Yet whilst American troops struggled through the nightmare at Omaha, something remarkable was happening further east along the British and Canadian landing zones. At Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, casualties from mines remained astonishingly low, not through luck, but through innovation. Rumbling ashore ahead of the infantry came machines that looked like they'd escaped from a madman's workshop. Tanks with enormous rotating drums, thrashing chains against the ground. Armoured vehicles carrying massive reels of fabric. Churchill tanks modified with flamethrowers and enormous mortar-like weapons. To the startled German defenders, these contraptions must have appeared utterly bizarre, almost comical. But there was nothing funny about their effectiveness. These were Hobart's funnies, and they were clearing minefields at a rate that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. The genesis of these extraordinary machines traced back to Britain's darkest hour. By 1940, the island nation stood alone against Nazi tyranny. France had fallen in a catastrophic 6-week campaign that exposed every weakness in Allied armoured doctrine. British tanks had proven inadequate, tactics outdated, and leadership often lacking imagination. Among the officers blamed for the debacle was Major General Percy Hobart, a prickly, difficult man whose abrasive personality had made him enemies throughout the War Office. Hobart had spent years advocating for radical changes in how tanks should be designed and deployed, arguments that earned him nothing but forced retirement. By 1940, this brilliant but troublesome officer found himself serving in the Home Guard as a humble corporal, directing traffic and training shopkeepers to fight with broomsticks should the Germans invade. But Winston Churchill understood something the hidebound generals did not. Wars are won by men who think differently, who see possibilities where others see only obstacles. Churchill had watched with growing alarm as conventional approaches repeatedly failed. The Prime Minister needed innovators, risk-takers, people willing to try the impossible. When Churchill learned that one of Britain's most creative armoured warfare theorists was wasting away in the Home Guard, he acted with characteristic decisiveness. Over the protests of senior officers who considered Hobart difficult and dangerous, Churchill personally ordered the general's recall to active duty. The Prime Minister's instructions were simple and direct. Prepare Britain's armoured forces for the eventual invasion of occupied Europe. Do whatever necessary, ignore the doubters. Hobart threw himself into the task with furious energy. He immediately recognized that the coming invasion would present challenges unlike anything encountered in North Africa or Italy. European beaches meant mines, vast belts of them, protecting every possible landing site. Intelligence reports indicated the Germans had laid over 6 million mines along the Atlantic Wall, with densities reaching 15 devices per metre in some sectors. Traditional mine clearance methods involved engineers crawling forward under fire, prodding the ground with bayonets, carefully lifting each mine by hand. The mathematics were brutally simple. Clearing a single beach sector this way would take days and cost thousands of lives. The invasion would fail before it properly began. Hobart understood that the solution required mechanization, but not merely bigger or better tanks. He needed entirely new categories of vehicles, each designed to solve a specific problem. The obstacles facing the invasion force were diverse: mines, barbed wire, concrete walls, anti-tank ditches, beach obstacles, mud, and fortified positions. Each required a different approach, a specialized tool where conventional military thinking demanded standardization and uniformity. Hobart envisioned a menagerie of odd machines, each one purpose-built for its particular task. His superiors thought him mad. His engineering teams wondered if the devices would work. But Hobart possessed something rare in military bureaucracies: the absolute confidence that his vision was correct and the political backing to make it reality. Percy Hobart arrived at his new command with a reputation that preceded him like artillery fire. Born in 1885, he'd spent decades developing theories about armoured warfare that most of his colleagues found either incomprehensible or threatening. During the interwar years, whilst other officers played polo and attended social functions, Hobart conducted relentless experiments with tank formations, communications, and tactics. He'd commanded the experimental tank brigade in the 1930s, pushing his crews through exhausting maneuvers that tested both machines and doctrine. His methods produced results. Britain developed some of the most advanced armoured tactics in the world, but his personality made implementation nearly impossible. Hobart didn't suffer fools, didn't hide his contempt for incompetence, and certainly didn't play the political games necessary for advancement in peacetime military establishments. This abrasiveness had consequences. Posted to Egypt in 1938 to create an armoured division from scratch, Hobart built the famous 7th Armoured Division, the Desert Rats, into a formidable fighting force. But his constant battles with superiors over tactics and equipment led to his removal in 1939. General Archibald Wavell, the Middle East commander, found Hobart impossible to work with despite acknowledging his brilliance. Forced into retirement at 55, Hobart watched from the sidelines as German panzers demonstrated in France the very tactics he'd been advocating for years. The vindication must have tasted bitter. Yet Churchill's intervention in 1940 gave him something more valuable than vindication. It gave him the authority to revolutionize British armoured forces without interference from the same men who'd dismissed him. Churchill assigned Hobart command of the 11th Armoured Division, with instructions to transform it into an elite formation. Hobart drove his troops mercilessly, conducting exercises that lasted days, pushing equipment to breaking point, demanding initiative and aggression from every level. Officers who couldn't adapt were removed. Soldiers learned to think creatively, to solve problems rather than wait for orders. By 1943, the division was among Britain's finest, but Hobart's real contribution was yet to come. In March 1943, he was given a new assignment: command of the 79th Armoured Division, a formation that would specialize in developing and deploying what the Army euphemistically called special devices. This vague terminology concealed an extraordinary mission. Hobart would create an entirely new branch of armoured warfare. The 79th Armoured Division became Hobart's laboratory. Unlike conventional divisions meant for frontline combat, this one existed to solve specific tactical problems through engineering innovation. Hobart assembled teams of engineers, tank crews, and weapons specialists, giving them a simple brief: examine every obstacle the invasion force would face and design a machine to overcome it. The mine problem topped the list. German beach defences relied heavily on S-mines. vicious devices nicknamed bouncing betties that leapt waist-high before exploding, and telemines capable of destroying tanks. Intelligence indicated the Germans were laying these weapons in overlapping patterns, sometimes stacking them in layers to defeat conventional clearance attempts. Any solution needed to operate under fire, move faster than a walking man, and survive multiple detonations. Hobart's engineers began with an idea from South African mine clearance operations in the Western Desert. There, desperate engineers had experimented with attaching rotating drums fitted with chains to the front of Matilda tanks. The chains, whipped against the ground by the spinning drums, would detonate pressure-detonated mines ahead of the vehicle. The early attempts were crude. Chains broke frequently, drums seized up, and the modification left tanks dangerously unbalanced. But the principle was sound. Hobart assigned teams to refine the concept, improve the engineering, and adapt it to the American Sherman tanks that would form the backbone of British armoured forces during the invasion. The result was the Sherman Crab, a machine that would prove crucial on D-Day. The Crab retained its main gun and could fight as a conventional tank, but mounted in front was a rotating drum nearly 3 meters wide, powered by a separate engine. From this drum hung 98 lengths of heavy chain. When activated, the drum rotated at 140 revolutions per minute, causing the chains to thrash the ground with tremendous force. The violence of the impact detonated pressure mines, whilst the tank remained safely behind. The device could clear a path 3 meters wide at walking speed, not fast, but infinitely quicker than hand clearance. Each Crab carried enough fuel to clear approximately 4 kilometers of minefield. The noise was extraordinary, a mechanical roar punctuated by the sharp crack of detonating mines. German defenders would soon learn to recognize and fear that distinctive sound, but Hobart wasn't finished. The mine problem was merely one challenge among many. His fertile mind conceived solutions to obstacles others hadn't even properly defined. Beaches might be too soft for tanks. Very well, develop a vehicle that could lay reinforcing matting. Concrete seawalls might block advances. Design a tank that could bridge them or blast through them. Pillboxes and bunkers might survive conventional shells. Create weapons specifically for destroying fortifications at close range. Each problem received dedicated attention, and Hobart's division grew into a bizarre collection of modified vehicles that resembled a mechanical circus more than a military formation. The Sherman Crab represented the culmination of 3 years of brutal trial and error. Early prototypes had been disasters, chains snapped under stress, drums bent out of shape, engines couldn't generate sufficient power, and the entire apparatus threw tanks off balance. Engineers worked through countless iterations, testing different chain lengths, link designs, and drum speeds. They experimented with various metals, discovering that hardened steel chains lasted longest but required enormous power to swing effectively. The solution involved mounting a Bedford engine taken from a lorry specifically to power the flail mechanism, leaving the tank's main engine free for propulsion. This dual-engine arrangement added weight and complexity, but it worked. By late 1943, production Crabs were rolling out of workshops across Britain. Each machine required extensive modifications to a standard Sherman tank. Technicians removed the bow machine gun to accommodate hydraulic systems that raised and lowered the flail drum. They reinforced the front hull to handle the stress of the rotating mechanism. Metal arms extending forward from the tank's sides supported the drum and absorbed the violent shaking when chains struck mines. The entire assembly weighed over 2 tons, but clever engineering distributed the load to maintain the tank's mobility. Crews required specialized training. Operating a Crab demanded coordination between driver, commander, and the operator controlling the flail mechanism. One mistake could drive the tank onto an uncleared mine or leave the flail tangled in obstacles. Training revealed unexpected complications. The flail created massive dust clouds that reduced visibility to almost zero, forcing commanders to navigate partly by dead reckoning. The deafening mechanical roar made radio communication difficult, requiring crews to develop hand signals and pre-arrange procedures. Chain breakage remained common. Each crab carried spare chains and crews learned to replace them under fire, a nerve-wracking procedure that involved dismounting whilst surrounded by live mines. The violence of multiple mine detonations damaged tracks, suspension, and occasionally broke welds in the hull. Engineers strengthened vulnerable points, but crabs remained mechanically fragile compared to standard Shermans. Hobart accepted these limitations. The machines didn't need to be perfect, merely effective enough to get infantry across the beaches alive. Operational doctrine evolved through relentless practice. Crabs would advance in echelon formations, each tank clearing a parallel lane through minefields. Infantry would follow exactly in the cleared paths, marked by the tank tracks. Supporting Shermans with functional guns would provide covering fire whilst the crabs worked. If a crab was disabled, another would push through to continue clearing. Speed was deliberately kept low. Rushing risked missing mines or throwing chains. The methodical pace frustrated aggressive commanders who wanted rapid advances, but Hobart insisted on thoroughness over speed. A lane cleared at 2 miles per hour was infinitely more valuable than a hasty advance that left infantry stranded in a minefield. The crab wasn't Hobart's only answer to the mine problem. His teams developed several complementary systems, each with different strengths. The Canadian indestructible roller device, universally known as CRD, pushed enormous steel wheels ahead of a tank. These wheels, deliberately designed to trigger mines, absorbed blasts that would destroy ordinary vehicles. The wheels themselves were expendable, but they protected the tank and crew. Sirds worked well in light minefields but struggled in deep sand and couldn't maintain the pace needed for assault operations. They found their niche in follow-up operations, clearing secondary routes once beachheads were established. Another approach involved the Conga, a trailer-mounted rocket that carried an explosive hose across a minefield. When detonated, the hose cleared a narrow path through sympathetic detonation of nearby mines. The Conga offered the advantage of operating from a safe distance. Crews could fire the rocket from behind cover, then advance through the cleared lane. However, the system was single-use, cumbersome to reload, and the paths it cleared were dangerously narrow. Hobart classified Congas as specialist equipment for particularly difficult obstacles rather than general-purpose tools. Engineers would deploy them against especially dense minefields or in situations where sending a crab forward would be suicidal. Field trials conducted throughout 1943 and early 1944 refined tactics and revealed capabilities. During one exercise on the Norfolk coast, a single crab cleared a 300-meter belt of practice mines in under 15 minutes, work that would have required a platoon of engineers several hours and likely produced multiple casualties. Another test demonstrated that crabs could operate effectively at night using carefully coordinated navigation techniques. Hobart's crews became increasingly confident, but the general remained grimly aware that exercises with practice mines bore little resemblance to advancing under artillery fire against fanatic defenders. The true test would come on French beaches, and failure would be measured in thousands of dead. Production accelerated through early 1944. By May, the 79th Armoured Division possessed over 300 operational crabs, with more arriving weekly. Crews trained constantly, often working 12-hour days to master the complex procedures. Hobart personally observed exercises, noting weaknesses and demanding improvements. He pushed his engineers to increase reliability, simplify maintenance, and reduce the time required to replace broken chains. The general understood that these bizarre machines represented the difference between success and catastrophe on D-Day. Intelligence estimates suggested German beach defences included over 15 mines per linear metre in some sectors. Traditional clearance methods would fail. The crabs had to work because there was no alternative. Whilst the crabs tackled mines, Hobart's engineers addressed every other beach obstacle with equal creativity. The Churchill AVRE, Armoured Vehicle Royal Engineers, became the workhorse of the specialised fleet. Based on the heavy Churchill tank, the AVRE sacrificed its conventional 75mm gun for a massive 290mm petard mortar. This stubby weapon fired a device troops nicknamed the Flying Dustbin, a 40-pound high-explosive charge designed specifically for demolishing concrete fortifications. The petard had absurdly short range, barely 80 metres, forcing crews to approach bunkers at point-blank distance, but when that massive charge struck a pillbox, the results were devastating. The explosion could collapse reinforced concrete, seal gun ports, or simply kill everyone inside through overpressure. The weapon required reloading from outside the turret, meaning a crewman had to expose himself to enemy fire whilst manhandling the heavy projectile. It was dangerous work, but infinitely safer than trying to destroy bunkers with conventional weapons. The AVRE's versatility extended far beyond its primary weapon. Engineers fitted these tanks with an array of attachments that transformed them into mobile problem solvers. The small box girder bridge allowed AVREs to cross anti-tank ditches or crater obstacles. The tank carried the bridge sections folded flat, then hydraulically raised and positioned them under fire. Once in place, following vehicles could cross whilst the AVRE moved on to tackle the next obstacle. Another modification, the fascine, involved enormous bundles of wooden logs bound tightly together. Avries carried these bundles on their front, dropping them into ditches to create instant crossings. Each fascine weighed nearly 2 tons and required careful positioning, but they enabled tanks to traverse obstacles that would otherwise halt an advance completely. The bobbin attachment addressed a problem unique to Normandy's beaches, soft sand and shingle that would bog down heavily laden vehicles. Engineers mounted enormous spools of reinforced coconut matting on AVRE chassis, creating mobile road layers. As the bobbin advanced, it unrolled this matting behind it, providing a temporary roadway that prevented following vehicles from sinking. The concept was beautifully simple, essentially laying carpet across a beach, but required precise engineering to ensure the matting deployed smoothly under combat conditions. Trials revealed that a single bobbin could lay over 100 metres of matting before exhausting its spool, enough to get vehicles off soft sand onto firmer ground. The matting itself, woven from coconut fibre and strengthened with steel wire, could support vehicles up to 40 tons. Perhaps the most fearsome of Hobart's creations was the Churchill Crocodile, a flamethrower tank of unprecedented power. The Crocodile towed an armoured trailer containing 400 gallons of fuel gel, connected to a flame projector that replaced the hull machine gun. Under pressure from nitrogen cylinders, the projector could throw a jet of burning gel over 100 metres. The psychological effect was extraordinary. German troops who'd withstood artillery bombardment and tank guns often broke and ran when faced with liquid fire. The Crocodile retained its turret gun, making it a fully capable battle tank even after exhausting its flame fuel. The towed trailer was deliberately designed with a quick-release coupling, allowing crews to jettison it if mobility became critical. Some 800 Crocodiles were eventually built, and they proved devastatingly effective against fortified positions throughout the Northwest Europe campaign. Other specialist vehicles filled specific niches. The Canal Defence light tank mounted a powerful searchlight and optical systems that could project dazzling beams to blind enemy positions or illuminate night operations. The armoured ramp carrier could position ramps against sea walls, allowing tanks to climb obstacles up to 4 meters high. The double onion demolition charge systems fired linked explosive charges that could be threaded through wire obstacles before detonation. Each device solved a particular problem, and Hobart's genius lay in recognizing that no single machine could address every challenge. The 79th Armoured Division needed a complete toolkit, and he was determined to provide it. American military observers watched Hobart's developments with deep skepticism. General Omar Bradley, commanding U.S. ground forces for the invasion, considered the specialized vehicles unnecessary complications. American doctrine emphasized standardization, mass production, and overwhelming firepower from conventional weapons. Bradley's staff calculated that sufficient artillery preparation and naval gunfire would suppress defenses, allowing infantry and standard tanks to advance without exotic machinery. They particularly disliked the maintenance burden. Each specialized vehicle required unique spare parts, trained crews, and specific tactical employment. The Americans accepted a small number of amphibious DD tanks, Shermans fitted with flotation screens, but rejected most of Hobart's other inventions. This decision would have fatal consequences at Omaha Beach. British and Canadian forces, by contrast, integrated Hobart's funnies into their assault plans from the beginning. Each brigade received attachments from the 79th Armoured Division, with detailed coordination worked out during months of rehearsals. Infantry commanders learned to work with crab operators, artillery officers practiced timing bombardments to allow AVREs to approach bunkers, and beachmasters developed traffic plans that accounted for bobbins laying matting whilst crabs cleared mines. The complexity was enormous, but Hobart's staff conducted endless exercises until procedures became routine. By early June 1944, British and Canadian assault forces represented the most technically sophisticated amphibious operation ever attempted. The hours before dawn on the 6th June 1944 found Hobart's specialized vehicles loaded aboard landing craft tank vessels, pitching through rough seas towards the Normandy coast. Months of planning now faced the ultimate test. British forces would assault Gold and Sword Beaches, Canadians would take Juneau, whilst Americans tackled Utah and Omaha. The arrangements reflected fundamental differences in approach. British and Canadian landing craft carried crabs, AVREs, crocodiles, and bobbins in carefully orchestrated waves, whilst American vessels held predominantly standard Shermans and infantry. General Bradley had accepted only 32 DD amphibious tanks for Omaha, rejecting the mine clearance and obstacle breaching equipment that Hobart considered essential. The contrasting casualty figures would soon validate or condemn these decisions. At Gold Beach, the first crabs touched down at 7:30 in the morning, immediately beginning their methodical advance through minefields that German engineers had spent months perfecting. The distinctive roar of flailing chains announced their arrival, a sound soon punctuated by the sharp crack of detonating mines. German defenders, already stunned by naval bombardment, found themselves facing machines they'd never encountered. Coastal artillery targeted the advancing crabs, but the tank's armor proved adequate against everything except direct hits from heavy guns. Infantry following in the cleared lanes suffered remarkably light casualties from mines, exactly as Hobart had predicted. Where mines did claim victims, they were typically soldiers who'd strayed outside the marked paths, ignoring orders to stay within the swept lanes. Sergeant Jim Holman of the Westminster Dragoons commanded a Crab that landed in the first wave at Gold. His account, recorded years later, captured the chaos and effectiveness of the operation. His tank's flail began thrashing as soon as the ramp dropped, chains immediately striking mines that detonated with violent force. Shrapnel rang against the hull, whilst the dust cloud from pulverized sand reduced visibility to meters. Holman navigated partly by compass, maintaining steady speed, whilst his operator kept the flail mechanism running. 3 mines detonated in the first minute, 4 more in the second. The violence shook the entire vehicle, but the Sherman's mechanical reliability kept them moving. Behind them, infantry sections advanced in disciplined files, following exactly in the cleared track. Holman's Crab cleared over 200 meters before breaking through the minefield belt onto clear ground, mission accomplished. Similar scenes unfolded across the British beaches. At Sword Beach, Major William Dunn commanded a squadron of AVREs tasked with destroying a massive concrete bunker that dominated the shoreline. His tanks advanced through lanes cleared by Crabs, then deployed into firing positions barely 60 meters from their target. The petard mortars began firing, each flying dustbin striking with tremendous force. The first round shattered observation slits, the second collapsed part of the roof, and the third penetrated the structure entirely. The bunker ceased firing within minutes, neutralized by weapons specifically designed for such work. Conventional tank guns would have required dozens of rounds at greater range, with uncertain results. The petard's massive charge made short work of fortifications that might otherwise have held up the advance for hours. Canadian forces at Juno Beach faced particularly difficult conditions, rocky obstacles beneath the waterline and a sea wall that blocked vehicle access. Bobbins deployed first, laying matting across shingle that would have trapped wheeled vehicles. AVREs followed, some dropping fascines into gaps between obstacles, others positioning small-box girder bridges against the seawall. The coordination was far from perfect. Several bobbins became stuck, one AVRE's bridge jammed during deployment, and German fire remained intense, but the overall effect was transformational. Within 90 minutes of landing, Canadians had established multiple vehicle routes off the beach, allowing armour and transport to move inland. The butcher's bill, whilst not light, was dramatically lower than it might have been without Hobart's inventions. The contrast at Omaha Beach proved heartbreaking. American forces, lacking specialized mine clearance vehicles and assault engineering equipment, encountered the full horror of German beach defenses. 27 of the 32 DD tanks sank in rough seas, never reaching shore. Engineers attempting to clear mines and obstacles by hand were cut down by machine gun fire. Infantry became pinned against the seawall, unable to advance across minefields without clearance support. Naval destroyers eventually moved dangerously close to shore, providing direct fire support that slowly suppressed German positions. American courage and determination eventually secured the beach, but at terrible cost, over 2,000 casualties in a single morning. Bradley's staff officers, watching the carnage, began to reconsider their rejection of British assault engineering methods. The statistical evidence was undeniable. At Gold Beach, British forces suffered approximately 400 casualties, tragic but sustainable. At Juno, Canadians took roughly 1,000 casualties, despite facing stronger defences than Gold. Sword Beach cost another 600 British casualties. These figures, whilst significant, represented success by amphibious assault standards. Omaha's 2,000-plus casualties, from roughly the same number of troops attempting a similar landing, told a different story. Post-battle analysis identified multiple factors. Omaha faced better positioned defences, rougher seas complicated the landing, and tactical mistakes compounded difficulties. But the absence of mine clearance, flails, and specialized assault vehicles was consistently cited as a critical disadvantage. Infantry cannot advance through minefields without either accepting horrific casualties or receiving mechanical assistance. The Americans had attempted the former, whilst the British employed the latter. The mine casualty statistics from D-Day revealed the extraordinary effectiveness of Hobart's methods with brutal clarity. British military analysts conducting post-operation assessments calculated that mine-related casualties at Gold and Sword beaches ran at approximately 10% of pre-invasion estimates, a 90% reduction that seemed almost impossible until examination of the evidence confirmed it. The Crabs had performed precisely as designed, clearing lanes fast enough to maintain momentum whilst protecting following infantry. Medical officers noted that mine injuries, typically among the most severe battlefield wounds, represented an unusually small proportion of British casualties. Where mines did kill or maim soldiers, investigation usually revealed breaches of discipline. Men wandering outside cleared lanes or advancing before flails completed their work. The machines themselves had functioned remarkably well under combat conditions that peacetime testing could never replicate. Individual Crab crews experienced the reality behind those statistics. Corporal Robert Davies of the 22nd Dragoons spent 4 hours methodically flailing through Gold Beach's defences, his tank detonating an estimated 47 mines without suffering disabling damage. His account described the peculiar rhythm of mine clearance under fire, maintain steady speed, watch for obstacles that might foul the chains, ignore the German shells bursting nearby, trust the armour to protect against splinters and small arms. Davies's tank suffered 3 broken chains during the operation, requiring hasty field repairs that exposed crewmen to enemy fire. They persisted because infantry lives depended on cleared lanes. By midday, Davies's Crab had created a route that 2 entire battalions used to move inland. The mathematics were straightforward, 1 5-man tank crew accepting risk to protect 2,000 infantrymen. The AVREs proved equally valuable, though their contribution was harder to quantify statistically. At Gold Beach's Le Hamel strongpoint, a massive concrete casemate housing an 88mm gun commanded the shoreline, its position carefully sited to provide interlocking fire with neighbouring positions. Conventional wisdom held that such fortifications required prolonged bombardment by heavy naval guns or airstrikes with massive bombs. Lieutenant John Breese commanded 3 AVREs that approached to point-blank range, absorbed hits from German infantry weapons, and systematically demolished the position with Petard rounds. The entire action lasted less than 20 minutes. Post-battle examination found the casemate's 2-metre-thick walls breached in multiple places, the interior devastated by overpressure and fragmentation. The 80mm gun crew had been killed to a man. This single example, multiplied across dozens of strongpoints, demonstrated that Hobart's flying dustbins could accomplish in minutes what might otherwise require hours. The crocodile flamethrowers generated perhaps the most dramatic results, though their employment remained controversial even among British commanders. At Sword Beach, a company of German infantry occupying trenches and bunkers refused surrender despite heavy bombardment. 3 crocodiles moved forward, their armoured fuel trailers clanking behind them. The first gout of flame shot across 100 metres of beach, liquid fire splashing into trench systems. The psychological shock was immediate. German soldiers abandoned positions that had withstood artillery, fleeing inland or surrendering. Military historians debating the ethics of flamethrowers note that actual deaths from crocodile attacks were often lower than from conventional weapons, as defenders typically surrendered or fled rather than face immolation. The terror factor exceeded the physical destructiveness, and British commanders used crocodiles specifically against positions where they wished to minimise both their own casualties and the need for prolonged fighting in built-up areas. The bobbin matlayers, perhaps the least dramatic of Hobart's vehicles, nevertheless proved essential to maintaining momentum. Gold Beach's eastern sector consisted of soft sand, overlying clay, a combination that trapped vehicles within meters of the waterline. Captain James Hill commanded a troop of bobbins that systematically laid coconut matting across the worst sections, creating roadways that remained passable throughout D-Day, despite thousands of vehicles crossing them. Engineers examining the matting weeks later found it compressed and damaged, but still functional. The simple technology, essentially reinforced carpet, had solved a problem that might otherwise have created catastrophic traffic jams on a beach still under occasional German artillery fire. Hill's after-action report dryly noted that the bobbin, whilst unglamorous, proved indispensable to preventing Gold Beach becoming a vehicle graveyard. Medical statistics provided another measure of success. Field hospitals established behind Gold and Sword beaches treated significantly fewer traumatic amputations and blast injuries than anticipated. Doctors had prepared for overwhelming numbers of mine victims, soldiers with legs blown off, abdominal wounds from upward blast, the horrific injuries that characterized mine warfare. Instead, they treated predominantly bullet wounds, shrapnel injuries, and the usual accidents of combat. The absence of mass mine casualties stood out so starkly that several medical officers specifically mentioned it in their reports. One surgeon noted that we prepared for butchery on an industrial scale and instead received a manageable stream of wounded. The flail tanks deserve more credit than they shall likely ever receive. German defenders provided inadvertent testimony to the machine's effectiveness. Interrogation reports from prisoners captured on D-Day reveal confusion and dismay about the British assault methods. Several German officers expressed bewilderment that their carefully prepared minefields had been neutralized so rapidly. One artillery observer described watching Crabs advance through defenses that had cost German engineers weeks to emplace, clearing them in minutes. Another account mentioned that defending troops initially thought the Crabs were some form of mine-laying vehicle and couldn't understand why British infantry seemed willing to walk directly behind them. The psychological impact of seeing supposedly impenetrable defences bypassed by strange machines contributed to the collapse of German morale in several sectors. The Normandy triumph validated Hobart's vision, but the general understood that D-Day represented merely the beginning. As Allied armies pushed inland through the summer and autumn of 1944, the 79th Armoured Division's specialised vehicles continued proving their worth. The bocage country of Normandy, with its thick hedgerows and sunken lanes, presented obstacles as challenging as beach defences. German troops transformed each hedgerow into a fortified position, lacing them with mines and positioning anti-tank guns to command every approach. Crabs found new employment clearing routes through these killing grounds, whilst AVREs demolished particularly stubborn strongpoints. The vehicles that critics had dismissed as one-use novelties for D-Day became permanent fixtures of British tactical doctrine. The autumn of 1944 brought Montgomery's ill-fated Operation Market Garden, followed by grinding battles through Belgium and Holland. Winter warfare in flooded terrain tested Hobart's vehicles in conditions never anticipated during their design. Crabs struggled in waterlogged ground where mines might be submerged, requiring modified tactics and careful reconnaissance. AVREs found unexpected utility bridging drainage ditches and crossing partially demolished causeways. Engineers developed additional attachments and modifications based on combat experience, a process Hobart encouraged. His division functioned as both operational unit and experimental laboratory, constantly refining techniques and equipment. By early 1945, the 79th Armoured Division had become an institution, its methods taught at training schools and its vehicles requested by commanders throughout 21st Army Group. The Rhine crossing in March 1945, Operation Plunder, presented Hobart with perhaps his greatest challenge. The Rhine represented Hitler's last natural barrier, defended by troops who understood that defeat meant invasion of the German heartland. Intelligence indicated massive mine belts protecting the river's eastern bank, with densities exceeding anything encountered in Normandy. The river itself was over 400 meters wide in the crossing sectors, too broad for conventional bridging operations under fire. German engineers had fortified the far bank with interconnected bunkers, trenches, and obstacles designed to annihilate any force attempting to establish a bridgehead. Montgomery's staff estimated that forcing the Rhine without specialized equipment would cost tens of thousands of casualties. Hobart's machines would need to perform flawlessly. Preparations began weeks in advance. The 79th Armoured Division assembled over 500 specialized vehicles, the largest concentration yet employed. Crabs underwent intensive maintenance, their chains replaced, and mechanisms overhauled. AVRE crews practiced assault drills until they could operate in darkness. New equipment arrived, including Churchill arcs, armoured ramp carriers that could position themselves as mobile bridges, allowing tanks to drive over them. Engineers developed modified LVTs, landing vehicles tracked, capable of ferrying AVREs and even crabs across the river. The planning complexity rivaled D-Day, with every vehicle's route, timing, and objective mapped in exhaustive detail. Hobart personally supervised rehearsals, his exacting standards unchanged, despite victory now seeming inevitable. The assault commenced on the night of 23rd March 1945, with massed artillery and aerial bombardment that dwarfed even D-Day's preparation. At first light on the 24th, specialized vehicles began crossing aboard landing craft and swimming LVTs. The reception was fierce. German troops, fighting now for their homeland, defended with desperate skill. Crabs touched down on the eastern bank and immediately began flailing through minefields, whilst under direct fire from 88mm guns positioned in concrete emplacements. Several crabs were knocked out within minutes, but others pressed forward, their chains thrashing steadily through the killing grounds. Infantry following in the cleared lanes took casualties, but established footholds that conventional assault methods might never have achieved. Sergeant William Shaw commanded a crab that cleared a critical path inland from the riverbank. His account described German resistance as the most intense he'd experienced, exceeding even D-Day's fury. Anti-tank rounds struck his Sherman repeatedly, one penetrating the flail mechanism and jamming the drum. Shaw's crew worked under fire to clear the jam, succeeded, and resumed flailing. Over the next 3 hours, his crab detonated an estimated 70 mines, creating a lane that an entire brigade used to move inland. Shaw's tank finally succumbed to an 88mm hit that destroyed the engine, but by then the mission was complete. He and his crew evacuated on foot, walking back down the lane they'd cleared, past infantry companies, advancing to exploit the breakthrough. Shaw received the Distinguished Conduct Medal, though he later insisted his crew deserved equal recognition. The AVREs faced their own trials. The German bunkers along the Rhine were more sophisticated than Normandy's beach defences, incorporating multiple chambers and overlapping fields of fire. Flying dustbins proved effective, but required multiple hits to neutralize each position. Lieutenant Michael Carr commanded an AVRE troop that systematically demolished a complex of 7 interconnected bunkers, a process that consumed nearly 4 hours and resulted in 2 AVREs damaged by return fire. Carr's after-action report noted that German defenders fought with suicidal determination, continuing to engage even as their positions collapsed around them. Only the petard's massive charge could reliably penetrate the reinforced concrete quickly enough to prevent defenders from inflicting unacceptable casualties on attacking infantry. Within 48 hours, 21st Army Group had established a secure bridgehead across the Rhine. Casualty figures, while substantial, ran well below staff estimates. Post-operation analysis credited the specialized assault vehicles with enabling the crossing at acceptable cost. German prisoners interrogated after the battle expressed surprise that British forces had crossed so quickly despite prepared defences. Several mentioned the mine-clearing tanks specifically, noting that their own forces possessed nothing comparable. The technological advantage that Hobart had championed since 1943 had proven decisive across multiple operations, fundamentally changing how modern armies approached fortified positions and obstacle belts. The war in Europe ended barely 6 weeks after the Rhine crossing, with German forces surrendering on 8th of May 1945. Percy Hobart, now 60 years old, could survey a remarkable legacy. His 79th Armoured Division had participated in every major British operation from D-Day forward, its vehicles clearing paths through obstacles that might otherwise have cost tens of thousands of lives. The statistics, compiled during post-war analysis, told an extraordinary story. Across the Northwest Europe campaign, British and Canadian forces, employing Hobart's specialised vehicles, experienced mine-related casualties at roughly 1/10, the rate of formations lacking such equipment. The 90% reduction observed on D-Day held remarkably consistent throughout subsequent operations, a testament to both the machine's effectiveness and the tactical doctrines Hobart had developed for their employment. Yet Hobart's contribution extended beyond mere casualty reduction. He had fundamentally altered military thinking about obstacles and fortifications. Before his innovations, armies viewed minefields and bunkers as problems requiring overwhelming force or accepting horrific losses to overcome. Hobart demonstrated that engineering creativity could neutralize defenses more efficiently than brute force. This represented a philosophical shift. Warfare need not consist solely of firepower contests, but could incorporate technological solutions to tactical problems. The implications reached far beyond World War II. Hobart had established that modern armies required specialized equipment and dedicated formations for assault engineering, concepts that would shape military organizations for generations. The immediate post-war years saw interest in Hobart's vehicles decline precipitously. Peacetime militaries, facing budget cuts and demobilization, had little appetite for maintaining expensive specialized equipment. The Crabs, AVREs, and Crocodiles that had proven so valuable found themselves mothballed or scrapped. Only a handful remained in service, maintained more from institutional inertia than strategic vision. Hobart himself retired in 1946, his health deteriorating after years of intense stress. He spent his final years writing memoirs and corresponding with former officers, watching with frustration as the lessons of the 79th Armoured Division were seemingly forgotten. He died in 1957, passing just as new conflicts would vindicate his methods once again. The Suez Crisis of 1956 reminded military planners why Hobart's inventions mattered. British forces assaulting Egyptian positions discovered that specialized assault equipment had been allowed to decay. Mine clearance reverted to hand methods, resulting in unnecessary casualties. The experience prompted hurried reactivation of surviving Crabs and accelerated development of new assault engineering vehicles. Throughout the Cold War, NATO forces maintained dedicated combat engineer formations equipped with modern equivalents of Hobart's funnies. The British Army developed the Centurion AVRE, then the Chieftain AVRE, each generation incorporating lessons from Hobart's original concepts whilst updating technology. The fundamental principle remained unchanged. Mechanical solutions to obstacle problems saved lives. Modern mine clearance technology owes direct lineage to Hobart's flails. Contemporary vehicles like the Aardvark and Trojan employ rotating drums with chains or hammers, clearing mines through mechanical detonation exactly as the Sherman Crab did 80 years earlier. Engineers have refined the technology. Modern flails use titanium chains, computer-controlled drum speeds, and integrated detection systems, but the core concept remains Hobart's. Similarly, modern assault-breaching vehicles trace ancestry to his AVREs, carrying bridge-laying equipment, fascines, and explosive charges for destroying obstacles. The British Army's Trojan vehicle, introduced in 2006, includes a Python mine clearance system that operates on principles similar to Hobart's Conga, firing explosive hoses across minefields to create cleared lanes. The Israeli Defense Forces, facing chronic mine threats, became perhaps Hobart's most devoted disciples. Israeli combat engineers studied British assault engineering doctrine extensively, developing their own specialized vehicles based on Hobart's principles. The Puma combat engineering vehicle, the Nakpadon mine clearing system, and various obstacle-breaching tanks all reflect design philosophies that Hobart pioneered. Israeli commanders, facing adversaries who relied heavily on mine warfare, understood that mechanical clearance offered the only viable alternative to accepting catastrophic casualties. Their tactical employment of engineering vehicles during conflicts in Lebanon and Gaza demonstrated that Hobart's concepts remained relevant in asymmetric warfare against irregular forces. American military doctrine, having learned bitter lessons at Omaha Beach, eventually embraced Hobart's approach. The U.S. Marine Corps developed specialized assault-breaching vehicles, including the assault breacher vehicle introduced in 2010. This machine combines a mine plow, a linear demolition charge system, and bridge-laying capability, essentially incorporating multiple Hobart concepts into a single platform. U.S. Army combat engineer battalions train extensively in mechanical breaching operations using equipment and techniques directly descended from the 79th Armoured Division's methods. The transformation from Bradley's skepticism in 1944 to full institutional acceptance took decades, but Hobart's vindication was complete. Academic military historians regard Hobart as among the most innovative British generals of the 20th century, though he remains largely unknown to the general public. His contribution extended beyond specific machines to encompass a way of thinking about military problems. Hobart demonstrated that creativity and engineering could achieve what traditional methods could not, that unorthodox solutions deserved consideration despite skepticism from conventional minds, and that saving soldiers' lives through technology represented the highest form of military leadership. These lessons resonate in contemporary debates about military innovation, acquisition processes, and the integration of new capabilities. The soldiers whose lives Hobart's machines saved rarely knew his name. They remembered the crabs that cleared paths through minefields, the AVREs that demolished bunkers, the crocodiles that broke enemy resistance. They told their children and grandchildren about the strange tanks that seemed to emerge from a fantasy, yet proved brutally effective in reality. These stories, passed down through families, preserved Hobart's legacy more effectively than official histories. The measure of his success wasn't found in medals or promotions, but in the thousands of men who returned home, because an irascible general refused to accept that obstacles required human sacrifice to overcome. Percy Hobart proved that one person's vision, backed by determination and political support, could fundamentally change how wars are fought and dramatically reduce the human cost of combat.